Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to this evening's session of HLF Online. And once again, we welcome you all to another edition of our online sessions. On my own behalf and on behalf of my fellow directors, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, and the entire team HLF, I welcome you to this evening's session. And for this session, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome one of India's best known writers, Perumal Murugan, and the translator, Nandini Krishnan, and the moderator for today's session, Srilata, to HLF. We, of course, some of you would, of course, remember that Perumal Murugan was with us at HLF a few years ago, and we had the honor of releasing his book Poonachi at HLF. And so we are extremely happy that we are able to bring him back to HLF in at least virtually to HLF. And the book, of course, that is in focus this evening is his latest novel, translated into English by Nandini Krishnan as Estuary. I think it would be silly on my part to try and introduce Murugan. He is, as I said, one of the best known writers in India today. And he has written nearly a dozen novels, including two sequels to Poonachi. And he also is a poet, and he also teaches in Namakkal, in a college in Namakkal. And besides being a novelist and a poet, he also has been, making news. And the novel that we are going to discuss today is Estuary, translated into English by Nandini Krishnan. Nandini herself is a writer. She has two books before translating this. I understand this is her first translation into English from Tamil, but she, at least I know one book about a couple of years ago on trans men that she wrote, and she also is the author of a book on arranged marriages. And Srilata is a poet, novelist, and a professor of English at IIT Madras. And so welcome to all three of you. We are very happy and delighted to welcome you to HLF this evening. And for those of our audience who have not had the opportunity to look up the book, let me very quickly try at least to give a kind of an intro to the book. This is a very unusual book for Murugan lovers, because this is a novel that talks about a middle-class man, a middle-aged middle-class government clerk, and his relationship with his young son, who is an engineering student. And their interaction is in a way mediated through technology. And of course, Murugan writes about the middle-aged man's fear of technology and what it can do, what damage it can do, and the young man's impatience with his father's phobia about technology. And of course, in between, Murugan gives a wonderful insight into the world in which we live today, which is mediated through technology and the education system. He himself is a college teacher. And something very interesting is that this is Murugan's first novel set in an urban setting, that is one. And also, interestingly, he locates this entire action of the novel in an imaginary place called Asuralokam. And whether how fictional it is something that I'm sure will come up during discussion. And with these few words of introduction to this evening's guests, and as well as the novel, I hand over the session to Srilata. Over to you, Srilata.
Good evening. And the Hyderabad Literary Festival feels like a homecoming to me, even though it's an online edition this year. For Hyderabad, has been where I spent many of my formative years. So this event also feels like a return of another sort to the work of Perumal Murugan, whom I've admired hugely for many years now. So thank you so much, Vijay, and thank you, Team HLF, for this special honor. Murugan sir, I have followed your work with great interest. Actually, quite by accident, I chanced upon V. Gita's translation, your novel Seasons of the Palm, and I just just a happy discovery, as they say, right? And I sort of fell in love with the book. I think to date it remains my favorite book. Estuary comes very close, but Seasons of the Palm is my all-time favorite, right? And subsequently then of course read your One Part Woman, and in fact it was part of a reading list for one of my courses for some time. And then Songs of a Coward, your book of poems in translation. We were in conversation at Spaces just before Cyclone Varda hit, you may remember that. Pyre, Poonachi, and now, of course, Estuary, Kazhimugam, right? So it seems to me that there is no subject that you leave untouched. That you have a perspective on a variety of things, and you're a very persuasive writer, right? So when we finish with your books, we come away feeling that yes, that's the only perspective to take on this in this particular subject, and you don't do it in a heavy-handed way. You do it with a great deal of gentleness, with a great deal of compassion and tenderness, which for all of us, I think, has begun to feel really special. The range of your subjects, from be it caste and the havoc that it plays with the lives of people, be it sexuality and the repression and what can happen because of that, or the subject of estuary, and there are many subjects. It's not just a one topic book. I think as your translator, I'm sure, has discovered, and other readers have discovered, right? So there is the dystopian world of education, school education and college education gone horribly wrong. Then there is the whole thing of a middle-aged man, as Vijay pointed out, and his very tender relationship with his young son, and how that plays out. So many things, right? Technology and youth and desire and all of it. So, as I said, you do it with a great deal of lightness of touch, and I really admire that. So, tell us about this book. Tell us about the writing of it. What brought you to it? What was the driving force, if you like, behind it uh, for the story, which to me, as a parent, somehow felt terrifyingly familiar?
ஓகே சோ அதாவது சார் அவங்க வந்து உங்களோட சீசன்ஸ் ஆஃப் த பாம் தான் முதல்ல படிச்சாங்க வி கீதாவுடைய மொழிபெயர்ப்புல படிச்சாங்க.
நந்தினி அந்த ஃபர்ஸ்ட் அவங்க அறிமுகப்படுத்தின அதெல்லாம் எனக்கு புரியுது. கடைசியா அந்த கேள்வி மட்டும் சொல்லிருங்க.
அவங்க வந்து இப்போ நீங்க எந்த ஒரு சப்ஜெக்ட் எடுத்தாலும் அத வந்து உங்களோட அதை படிக்கிறவங்க உங்களோட அபிப்பிராயத்தை தவிர்த்து வேற எந்த அபிப்பிராயமும் வைத்து கொள்ள முடியாத வகையில நீங்க எழுதுறீங்க. அதுவும் நீங்க எழுதுற விதம் வந்து அதுல ஒரு கனிவு, மென்மை, வலிமை எல்லாமே சேர்ந்து வருது. சோ சாதியா இருக்கட்டும், இல்லாட்டி மக்களுடைய வாழ்க்கையா இருக்கட்டும், ஆண் பெண் உறவா இருக்கட்டும், இந்த மாதிரி நிறைய விஷயங்கள் உங்களோட நாவல்கள்ல வருது. இது வந்து அவங்க ஒரு ப்ரொஃபஸரா இருக்கிறதுனால பள்ளி மற்றும் உயர்கல்வியில இருக்கிற கஷ்டங்கள், அதாவது ஸ்டூடெண்ட்ஸ்க்கு இருக்கிற கஷ்டங்கள், அப்புறம் அதோட சேர்த்து ஒரு நடுவயது ஆண் அவருக்கு வந்து நடக்கிற வெவ்வேறு பிரச்சனைகள், அப்புறம் மகனோடய இருக்கிற அவரோட உறவு எல்லாம் ரொம்ப அழகா கொண்டு வந்திருக்கீங்க. இந்த மாதிரி ஒரு நாவல், இவ்ளோ சப்ஜெக்ட்ஸ் வந்து ஒன்னா கூடி இருக்கிற நாவல் உங்களுக்கு எழுதணும் அப்படின்னு எப்படி தோணிச்சு?
இந்த நாவல் எழுதுறதுக்கு ஆக்சுவலா சொல்ல போனா நான் ரொம்ப பிளான் எல்லாம் பண்ணல. ஒரு 2015க்கு முன்னால, இன்னும் சொல்ல போனா 2017க்கு முன்னால இப்படி ஒரு தீம்ல நான் நாவல் எழுதுவேன்னு எனக்கே கூட தெரியாது. அந்த மாதிரி எனக்கு எந்த விதமான திட்டமும் இல்லாம திடீர்னு உருவாகி எழுதின நாவல் தான் இது. பூனாச்சி எழுதுனதுக்கு அப்புறம் வேற என்ன எழுதலாம் அப்படிங்கும் போது எனக்கு ஒரு எண்ணம் என்ன வந்துச்சுன்னா, கிராமத்தை விட்டு ஒரு நகரத்தை வச்சு எழுதுவோம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு ஒரு எண்ணம் வந்தது எனக்கு. அப்போ நகர வாழ்க்கை அப்படின்னு சொல்லும்போது அதுல வந்து முக்கியமா எதை மையப்படுத்துறது அப்படின்னு கேள்வி வந்தபோது கல்வி சம்பந்தமா எனக்கு நிறைய விஷயங்கள் தெரியும். நிறைய மாணவர்களை பார்த்துக்கிட்டு இருக்கேன். அது சம்பந்தமா தொடர்ந்து என்னுடைய கவனம் இருந்துகிட்டு இருக்குது. ஆகவே இன்னைக்கு இருக்கக்கூடிய இந்த கல்வி முறை அதை வந்து கிரிட்டிசைஸ் பண்ணணும் அப்படிங்கிறது தான் என்னுடைய எய்மா இருந்தது. அதை வெறுமனே வந்து ஒரு கட்டுரையா அந்த மாதிரி எழுதாம இன்னைக்கு இருக்கக்கூடிய ஒரு மிடில் கிளாஸ் ஒரு நடுத்தர வயதுக்காரருடைய பார்வையை வந்து கொண்டு வரணும்னு நினைச்சேன். அதுவும் நான் வந்து என்னுடைய நண்பர்கள் இப்படி இருக்கக்கூடியவர்களை தொடர்ந்து பார்க்கக்கூடியது. சில விஷயங்கள் நானே ஃபீல் பண்ணினது. ஆக இதையெல்லாம் இணைச்சு ஒரு கேரக்டரை உருவாக்கி அதை மையமா வச்சு பண்ணணும் அப்படின்னு எனக்கு தோணுச்சு. ஆக 2017 தான் எனக்கு இந்த இந்த எண்ணமே தோன்றுச்சு. தோன்றி ஒரு ஒரு கிட்டத்தட்ட அதுக்கு அந்த ப்ராசஸ் அது மனசுல நடந்தது, எழுதுனது எல்லாம் சேர்த்து ஒரு 6 மாசம் எடுத்துக்கொண்டேன். ஒரு 6 மாசத்துல எழுதுனதுதான். அப்புறம் ஒண்ணே ஒண்ணு நான் இதை எழுதும்போது என்ன நினைச்சேன்னா, இத வந்து ஒரு பகடி செஞ்சு எழுதணும். அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு அந்த அந்த தொனியில அந்த மாதிரியான ஒரு தொனியில நான் இதுவரைக்கும் எழுதுனதில்ல. ஆகவே இப்ப அத ட்ரை பண்ணி பார்க்கணும் அப்படின்னு நினைச்சேன். இதுதான் வந்து இந்த நாவல் உருவானதுக்கான ஒரு பின்னணி.
Right. So, sir said that he hadn't planned much, to write this novel. In fact, before 2015, maybe even before 2017, there was not a notion in his head that he would write on such a theme. So after Poonachi, when he was thinking about what he would do next, he thought he had this impulse to leave the village and come to the city, write a novel based in the city for the first time. And then he thought about what he knew about the city, what he could write about with confidence. And then it struck him that as a professor, he has met students who come from the city, and therefore that was something to which he could relate. And he felt there was a strong need to criticize the educational system and the ways in which it is structured. But rather than write an essay or, write a critical article or whatever, he decided that he should put it in a novel and explore it in a much deeper manner. And also, while he was working on this, he thought about the idea of a middle-aged man and what he goes through. And there were lots of conversations with his own friends who were around that age, which contributed to this. And so it was basically around 2017 that the idea came to him. And in what will make everybody envious, he took 6 months right from the inception of the idea to finishing his novel. And another important thing was that when he wanted a particular tone for the novel, which would be parody, satire, because the resonance of parody is not something that he has touched upon so far in his novel. So he wanted to experiment with that tone. And so these were his motivations.
Just to kind of draw on that point a little bit more, why Asuras and why Asurapuri or Asura Lokam, right? And also, what did fiction allow you to do that, say, writing an essay, treating the same subject via an essay or a piece in the newspaper would not have allowed?
சார், அதாவது அசுரர்களை கதாபாத்திரங்களா வைத்துட்டு அசுர லோகம், அசுரபுரி அப்படின்ற ஒரு உலகத்தை உருவாக்குறதுக்கு காரணம் என்ன? அண்ட் இந்த நாவல் மூலியமா நீங்க எழுதக்கூடியது ஆனா கட்டுரையில எழுத முடியாதது அப்படின்னு நீங்க என்ன சொல்லுவீங்க?
அசுரலோகம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லி நான் வச்சுக்கிட்டதுக்கான காரணம் என்ன அப்படின்னு சொன்னா, நான் பூனாச்சியில நான் முன்னாலேயே சொன்னது போலதான் மனிதர்களை பற்றி எழுதுறதுக்கு எனக்கு அச்சமா இருக்கு அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு விஷயம். அந்த காரணத்தினால அப்போ நாம எப்படி ஒரு கேரக்டர் என்னவா வந்து வச்சு எழுதுறதுன்னு நான் யோசிச்ச போது, சரி, தெய்வங்களை பத்தி எழுத முடியாது, மனிதர்களை எழுத முடியாது, தேவர்களை பத்தியும் எழுத முடியாது. அப்ப சரி, அதுக்கு எதிரான ஒரு கேரக்டர் அப்படின்னு சொன்னோம்னா அசுரர்கள். அசுரர்களை நாம பொதுவா அசுரர் அப்படின்னு சொன்னோம்னாவே அவங்க தீயவர்கள், கெட்டவர்கள், எல்லா விதமான தீமையினுடைய வடிவம் அப்படிங்கிற மாதிரியான ஒரு பிம்பம் தான் நம்முடைய புராணங்கள் மூலமாக நமக்கு கிடைச்சிருக்கு. ஆகவே அந்த அடிப்படையில அந்த கேரக்டரை நாம வந்து வச்சு அசுரர்னு வச்சு எழுதும் போது யாரும் ஒன்றும் சொல்றதுக்கு வாய்ப்பு இல்லை அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு எண்ணம் எனக்கு தோணுச்சு. அப்புறம் இன்னொன்னு என்ன அப்படின்னு சொன்னா, தமிழ்நாட்டுடைய அரசியல்ல பெரியாருடைய வாசிப்பு, புராணங்களை அவருடைய பாணியில வாசிச்ச போது திராவிடர்களைத்தான் அசுரர்கள் என்று புராணங்கள் குறிப்பிடுகின்றன அப்படிங்கிறது அவருடைய வாசிப்பு. அதை ஒட்டி திராவிட இயக்கத்தினுடைய கொள்கையே பார்த்தீங்கன்னு சொன்னா ராவணன், நரகாசுரன் இவர்களை எல்லாம் போற்றுவது அப்படிங்கிறது திராவிட இயக்கத்தினுடைய ஒரு அரசியல் கொள்கை அது. ஆக அந்த அடிப்படையிலையும் அந்த வகையில வச்சு பார்த்தோம்னு சொன்னாலும் நாம அசுரரை எழுதுவது அப்படின்னு சொல்லும்போது அது திராவிடர்களை எழுதுவது, தமிழர்களை எழுதுவது அப்படிங்கிற எண்ணம் எனக்கு இருந்துச்சு. ஆகவே நாம நேரடியா மனிதர்னு சொல்லலினாலும் இந்த கோணத்துல பார்த்தோம் அப்படின்னு சொன்னோம்னா அசுரர்கள் இப்படி பொருந்தி வருகிறார்கள் அப்படின்னு எனக்கு தோணுச்சு. ஆக அந்த அடிப்படையில அசுரலோகம்னு வச்சேன். அடுத்தடுத்த நாவல்ல கூட அதை இன்னும் கொஞ்சம் விரிவாக்கி அந்த அசுரலோகம்ங்கிறது இன்னும் கொஞ்சம் பெருசு பண்ணணும் அப்படின்னு எனக்கு எண்ணம் இருக்கு. இது ஒண்ணு. இன்னொரு கேள்வி என்ன நந்தினிங்க சொன்னீங்க?
அதாவது நாவல் மூலியமா நீங்க சில
கட்டுரை
மூலியமா பார்க்க முடியாது, நாவல் மூலியமா எப்படி?
ஆமா, கட்டுரையில நாம பார்த்தீங்கன்னு சொன்னா நாம ஏதாவது ஒரு விஷயத்தை எடுத்தோம்னா அந்த விஷயத்தை டிஸ்கஸ் பண்றதுதான் இருக்கும். அது கருத்து சார்ந்ததாக இருக்கும். மனித உணர்வுகள் சார்ந்ததாக கட்டுரையில பெரும்பாலும் இருக்காது. நாவல் அந்த மாதிரி நாம மனித உணர்வுகளுக்கு தான் இதுல முக்கியத்துவம். நான் இதுல கல்வி பத்தி எழுதியிருக்கேன், ஒரு அரசு அலுவலகங்களை பத்தி எழுதியிருக்கேன். இதெல்லாம் பாத்தீங்கன்னு சொன்னா பேக்ரவுண்டு அந்த மாதிரிதான். அந்த சூழல்ல இருக்கக்கூடிய மனிதர்களுடைய உணர்வுகள் என்ன, அவர்களுக்கு ஏற்படக்கூடிய பயம், அச்சம், அப்புறம் இன்னும் மற்ற பலவிதமான உணர்வுகள், வாழ்க்கை பற்றியான பயம், இது எல்லாத்தையும் அந்த மாதிரியான உணர்வுகளை கொண்டு வருவதுங்கிறது ஒரு படைப்புல தான் முடியும். ஆகவே எப்போதுமே எனக்கு எந்த ஒரு விஷயத்தையுமே ஒரு படைப்பாக்கும் போதுதான் ஒரு குறைஞ்சபட்ச திருப்தி எனக்கு ஏற்படும். அந்த அடிப்படையில தான் இதை முக்கியம்னு கருதுறேன். நான் கல்வி சம்பந்தமா நிறைய கட்டுரைகள் எழுதியிருக்கேன். பட் அந்த கட்டுரைகளுக்கெல்லாம் பாத்தீங்கன்னு சொன்னா அந்தந்த சமயத்தோட அது முடிஞ்சு போயிடக்கூடிய விஷயமா இருக்கு. ஆனா ஒரு படைப்புல பாத்தீங்கன்னா இதையெல்லாம் நாம பண்ண முடியுது. இப்போ ஒரு ஒரு கடிவாளம் போடக்கூடிய ஒரு விஷயத்த ஒரு படைப்புல தான் கொண்டு வர முடியும். ஒரு கட்டுரையில அதை கட்டாயம் கொண்டு வரவே முடியாது. அது மாதிரி ஏராளமான ஒரு விஷயத்தை நாம விமர்சிக்கும் போது கூட அதை கற்பனை செய்து கற்பனையில ரொம்ப அற்புதமான ஒரு காட்சியாக அதை மாற்றக்கூடிய ஒரு வாய்ப்பு அது படைப்புல தான் இருக்கு. ஆகவே அந்த அடிப்படையில தான் இதை வித்தியாசப்படுத்தி பார்க்கணும்.
Right. So the reason is something which he has also referred to in Poonachi itself, and something he alludes to in the foreword. In fact, Poonachi, though I read it 2 years ago, I can never forget the foreword where he says, "You can't write about, it's a crime to write about humans. It's a huge crime to write about the gods. So therefore, you can't write about the devas either. Therefore, what you're left with is animals, and among animals, you can't write about cows, and you can't write about pigs. And dogs and cats are boring. Therefore, a goat is what I could write about." I remember that so well. So it's the same way. Since he said you can't write about gods, you can't write about devas either. So what is the opposite? Asuras. And asuras are considered evil. They are bad. They are the personification of everything that is undesirable. And so as long as you got those characters as the main characters in the book, no one can object to the book or raise a protest saying, "Oh, you've insulted these evil people," because they are evil by definition. But also another perspective is, if you look at the history of Tamil politics and the reading of the Puranas by Ivera or Periyar, as he's known, his perspective was that the Puranas portray asuras in a manner that fits with Dravidians, like their appearance, their mien, everything can be seen as an allegory of Dravidians, and therefore one of the things which his party and all its branches have done is that they've taken to praising Ravana and Narakasura and all these asuras who are considered evil and who've been vanquished, but looking at their positive qualities. And therefore, in a way, if you follow Periyar's perspective, it's kind of to write about asuras is something like writing about Tamilians. So there is this perspective also. So this is a world that's familiar to us. So, sir, now no sollala, sir. This is going into dangerous territory. So we will mention that he's writing about asuras and not Tamilians. The second question you asked, which was why he prefers fiction as a medium to the essay, is that once you take up a topic in an essay, the discussion is entirely woven around it, and there's no scope to explore emotions. You're constantly sticking with opinions. And though he's brought about certain things like education, government policy, and that sort of thing, all this is only a setting or a backdrop. And what is in the foreground is asura emotion and the feelings of asuras, and people, and the various fears they have: fear of the future, fear of the world, fear of what's going to come next, fear of whether they've done something wrong or not. So he's always found that fiction gives him a very fertile medium to explore these things. And for instance, like he was giving us certain examples from, there's a scene where students are made to wear bridles in a certain college, so that like horses, so that you have a blinkered perspective of the world. And so these are not things which he can write about in an essay or an opinion piece in the newspaper. So this fiction gives him scope to make things a lot more vivid. And also a fictional work has a far longer lifespan than an essay, because once you're done with the essay, you're done. Whereas this is something which will remain in people's minds, which will be brought up over and over again, and therefore he felt it needed this medium.
Okay, so there is an the opening lines of Estuary, right? I think those who make many people who are parents smile. This smile of recognition, right? And this is how it goes. The call of Yama is certain. A call from one's son is an event, right? So could you please, both of you, if possible, if you have the text with you, Murugan sir and Nandini, read an excerpt, highlighting what I really loved about that chapter is those 7 questions that Kumarasura, the father, the protagonist, has, always has for his son who's away in hostel. And it's like a catechism, right? It's like a pre-written script, and he cannot deviate from that. And he always asks him, whatever. He has a set of 7 questions. So if you could read that passage, both of you, that would be great.
நான் வாசிக்கிறேன். நந்தினி, நான் வாசிக்கிறேன். ஹலோ, கேக்குதுங்களா நான் பேசுறது?
கேக்குதுங்க.
நான் வாசிக்கிறேன். யமன் அழைப்பு உறுதி, மகன் அழைப்பு அரிது. இப்படித்தான் நேற்று இரவு வரை குமராசுரர் நினைத்து கொண்டிருந்தார். பொறியியல் கல்லூரியில் மேகா சேர்ந்து ஒரு பருவம் முடிந்து விட்டது. பருவத் தேர்வெழுதி விடுமுறை நாட்களை வீட்டில் தூங்கியே கழித்து இப்போது 2ஆம் பருவத்திற்கு போயிருக்கிறான். முடிந்து போன 180 நாட்களில் ஒரு நாளேனும் அவனாக செல்பேசி மணி என நேரம் முடிவு செய்து வைத்து அவனை அழைப்பார். விடுதி உணவகத்தில் அவன் சாப்பிட்டு முடித்து வந்திருக்கும் நேரம் அது. அறையிலோ வெளியிலோ நண்பர்களுடன் அரட்டை அடித்துக் கொண்டிருக்க கூடும். எங்கிருக்கிற ஐயா என்று ஒரு முறை கேட்டதற்கு, எங்கிருப்பாங்க, ஹாஸ்டல்ல தான் என்று எரிந்து விழுந்தான். அதற்கு பிறகு அந்த கேள்வியை கேட்பதை அவர் தவிர்த்தார். அழைப்பை ஏற்று பேசியை எடுத்ததும் சொல்லுப்பா என்பான். அது ஒன்றுதான் அவன் பேசும் வார்த்தை. அதுவும் ஒரு நாள் வேகமாக வரும், இன்னொரு நாள் மெலிதாக வரும், மற்றொரு நாள் எரிச்சலாக வரும், அடுத்து ஒரு நாள் வெறுப்பாக வரும். ஒரு சொல் எத்தனையோ உணர்ச்சிகளை பொதிந்து வைத்திருக்கும் கிடங்கு. உருவி எடுக்கும் போது அதிலிருந்து எவ்வகை உணர்ச்சி வெளிப்படும் என்பது யாருக்கும் தெரியாது. வெளிவந்த பிறகுதான் வெடிப்பா, உஸ்வானமா, நீரோட்டமா என்பதை அறிய முடியும். இன்றைக்கு என்ன வகையில் வார்த்தை வருகிறது என்பதை கண்டறிய அவருக்கு நொடி நேரம் போதும். அதை அனுசரிக்க அவர் மனமும் அந்த நொடிக்குள்ளேயே தயாராகிவிடும். பிறகு அவர்தான் கேள்விகளை கேட்பார். கேள்வி வரிசை இப்படி இருக்கும். நல்லா இருக்கிறையா ஐயா? காலேஜுக்கு போனியா ஐயா? சாப்பிட்டையா ஐயா? காசு இருக்குதா ஐயா? துணி துவைச்சு போட்டுக்கிறையா ஐயா, படிக்கிறையா ஐயா, வச்சிருட்டுமா ஐயா? 7 கேள்விகள் தான். முதலும் முடிவும் ஒருபோதும் மாறாது, எண்ணிக்கையிலும் மாற்றமில்லை. நடுக்கேள்விகள் கொஞ்சம் முன்பின் மாறும். எல்லா கேள்விகளுக்கும் அவனிடமிருந்து வருவது ஒற்றை ஒளிக்குறிப்பு பதில், அவ்வளவுதான். சில இம்களை காதில் கேட்காத கால் மாத்திரை அளவுக்கு சுருக்குவான். அரை மாத்திரை இம்மும் வரும். சில இம்களை என்று 1-1.5 மாத்திரை அளவுக்கு சற்றே நீட்டுவான். கடைசி இம் கொஞ்சம் வலுவாகவே 2 மாத்திரையில் வரும். மகன் இப்படி பேசுவதை ஒரு நாள் தன் நண்பரிடம் சொன்னார் குமராசுரர்.
So I'll read the English translation. I just wanted, I was having some network trouble. Are you able to see and hear me fine, Srilata?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, great. So this is the English translation. The call of Yama is certain. A call from one's son is an event. This had been Kumarasura's philosophy until the previous night. His son Meghas had finished a semester of his engineering degree. Having written his exams, he had spent his holidays sleeping at home and had just returned to college for the second semester. In the 180 days he had been away during the first term, he had never once called his father. But Kumarasurar had called him every evening at 8. Meghas would have finished his dinner at the hostel mess. He would either be in his room or hanging out with his friends outside the hostel. Where are you, Ayya? Kumarasurar had once asked. Where could I be? In the hostel, Meghas had snapped. Since then, Kumarasurar had stopped asking the question. On answering the phone, Meghas would say, Solapa, tell me, Appa, his only word through the entire call. On some days, he said it fast. On others, he said it gently. On still others, he barked it out. And there were days when he seemed to speak it with hate and resentment. A single word could be a storehouse of emotions, each utterance stirring a different one. It could unleash a torrent, a flash flood, a stream, a wave. Kumarasurar would instantly guess Meghas's mood from his intonation and fortify himself to counter it. He would ask his questions in this order. Are you well, Ayya? Did you go to class, Ayya? Have you eaten, Ayya? Do you have enough money, Ayya? Have you washed your clothes and hung them out to dry, Ayya? Are you studying, Ayya? Shall I hang up, Ayya? 7 questions. The first and the last remained in their fixed spots. The number of questions was unvaried too. The other 5 questions might occasionally change seats. To each, Meghas offered a single monosyllabic answer. That was it. Some of his ims were, in fact, demisyllabic. Some were even quarter syllables that Kumarasurar's ears could barely register. Some became and occasionally venturing into a syllable and a half. The final was the strongest of all, sometimes hitting a disyllabic count. One day, Kumarasurar had told his friend about this pattern of conversation.
Thank you. I just love that bit, actually. I think another personal favorite was, the way in which you show us the monotony of the government job, the 9 to 5, the grind of that. And also sometimes, just the sheer pointlessness and the bizarre nature of some things about that kind of jobs, right? For instance, the calendar and its printing and how it gets done in this painful, slow way, right? And other sorts of things, even the suspicion that older generations of government employees have towards computerization, for example, right? All of it, again, feels a little vaguely familiar to me. So if I could request you to read that passage, especially the one about the calendar, maybe just a little short excerpt.
That I have to explain to the viewers what is going on. So basically, Murugan sir, because of his busy schedule, has been caught in the middle of something else and doesn't have the book with him. So I'm sending him texts. But sir, அவங்க கேட்டதை நான் சொல்லிடுறேன். அதாவது அந்த ஒரு அரசியல் உத்தியோகத்துல இருக்கிற ஒரு டல்னஸ், அதாவது வேலைக்கு போகணுமே அப்படின்ற போற ஒரு ஃபீலிங். அப்புறம் ஒரு தலைமுறை சேர்ந்தவர்கள் வந்து இந்த மாதிரி கணிப்பொறி வர்றது, கம்ப்யூட்டரைசேஷன், அந்த டிஜிட்டல் இதுக்கு வந்து பார்க்கும் போது ஒரு மாதிரி ஐயோ இது வரணுமா அப்படின்ற ஒரு சந்தேகமா பாக்குறது, அதெல்லாம் உங்களுக்கு ரொம்ப பிடிச்சது. So the calendar பத்தி நீங்க எழுதி இருக்கிறது வந்து
ஆமாமா.
கேட்கணும்னு சொல்றாங்க.
Yeah, Nandini, if
Yeah.
Murugan doesn't have the original text with him,
Right.
he can just talk about it and you can read the English
Yeah.
section. That would be
Yeah.
better.
Okay. Or I can possibly, are you sure about that? Because I could also send him a picture so that he can read it.
Yeah, that might, I mean, take time, right? I mean,
Okay, sure.
yeah. So let him talk
sir,
about,
on
let him talk
the
about the
scene.
context,
Yeah.
read the English version.
Sure.
Is that okay,
I'll do that.
Srilata?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sir,
Thank you.
அதாவது அந்த சீன் வந்து நீங்க ஏன் எழுதினீங்க, எப்படி வந்தது அப்படின்னு கொஞ்சம் ஒரு பேக்ரவுண்ட் கொடுத்தா நான் ஆங்கிலத்துல படிச்சிடுறேன்.
சரி. அந்த அது இங்க ஒரு பொதுவா ஒரு அரசு அப்படிங்கிறதனுடைய அதனுடைய செயல்பாடு வந்து என்ன மாதிரி இருக்குங்கிறத அத வந்து விமர்சிக்கணுங்கிற கண்ணோட்டத்துல எழுதுனது தான் அந்த காட்சி. அது ஒரு சான்று, அவ்வளவுதான். அப்புறம் பொதுவா அரசு ஊழியர்களுக்கு இருக்கக்கூடிய அவங்களுக்கு இருக்கக்கூடிய அச்சத்தையும் காட்டணும் அப்படிங்கிறதுதான். நீங்க காலண்டர்ங்கிறது ஒரு சாதாரணமான ஒரு விஷயம். நாம வந்து வருஷ தொடக்கத்துல வாங்குறோம், செவுத்துல மாட்டிடுறோம் அப்படிங்கிறது அது மட்டும் அல்ல அதுல. அதுல பல்வேறு விஷயங்கள் இருக்குது. நீங்க எனக்கு நிறைய சம்பவங்கள் அத பத்தி தெரியும். அந்த காலண்டர பத்தி வச்சு மட்டுமே நிறைய சம்பவங்கள் வந்து அரசு அலுவலகங்கள்ல நடந்த சம்பவங்கள் எனக்கு தெரியும். அதனால அது வந்து எனக்கு அந்த அந்த வேலை, அந்த அரசனுடைய செயல்பாடு, இத நாம வந்து விமர்சிப்பதற்கு அது ரொம்ப பொருத்தமான ஒரு விஷயமா இருக்கும் அப்படின்னு பட்டது. அற்பம்னு கருதக்கூடிய ஒண்ணு, அது வந்து ஒரு பெரிய விஷயமா எப்படி அங்க இருக்குதுங்கிறத காட்டுறதுக்கு அது உதவும் ஒரு உதாரணமா எனக்கு பட்டது. அந்த அடிப்படையில தான் அத வச்சேன் நான்.
சார், நீங்க வந்து ரெண்டு சான்றுகள் உங்களுக்கே தெரியும்னு சொல்லிருக்கீங்க. நிஜ வாழ்க்கையில இருந்து பேச முடிஞ்சா கொஞ்சம் 1-2 சொல்றீங்களா?
இப்ப ஒரு ஒரு முறை ஒரு காலண்டர்ல ஒரு முதலமைச்சர் படம் இருக்குது. அந்த காலண்டர் ஒரு மாசம் முடியும் போது கிழிச்சு குப்பை கூடையில போடுவாங்க இல்லையா? குப்பை கூடையில அந்த மாதிரி ஒரு புரோசர் வந்து கிழிச்சு குப்பை கூடையில போட்டாரு. அது என்னாச்சு அப்படின்னா, இந்த மாதிரி வந்து அவருக்கு முதலமைச்சரை பிடிக்காது, அதனால அவரு வந்து குப்பை கூடையில போட்டாரு. போட்டது மட்டும் இல்ல, அவரு கால்ல வந்து ஒரு மிதிச்சு விட்டாரு அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு ஒருத்தரை டிரான்ஸ்ஃபரே பண்ணிட்டாங்க.
So this is something really interesting. The scene which Srilata mentioned is something which is actually based on real experience. So what Srilata said, maybe I should read the part first so that
Yes.
there'd be some context for the readers.
Yeah.
So what's happened so far is, Kumarasurar has told his friend about all these questions and this wonderful exchange he has with his son where, all his questions are countered by and his son says, no, his friend says, why don't you talk about interesting things, talk about cinema, talk about politics. So he's thinking, what can I say? What can I talk about? He says, could he stop politics? He was a civil servant. He was afraid to speak about the government, especially after what had happened to one of his colleagues. That man had been so enthusiastic about things that as soon as each year ended, he would change calendars. In the calendar provided by the government, the pages for the 12 months of the year featured pictures of the king in robes of different colors. It would take at least 7 months for the new calendar to reach office. It was only after the turn of the year that the authorities began the annual deliberations on the calendar. A calendar committee would be set up, and it would take them 4 months to prepare a report. Their suggestions would have to be taken into consideration, executed, and the costs calculated. The government's official printing press would have to be paid and the calendars checked. Once they were approved by the competent authorities, they would be sent to the head office and then distributed to each department. This was no easy task, and it was commendable that it was usually achieved under 8 months. It took yet another month for each department to distribute it to its constituent branches. So the government's calendar did its job only for the last 3 months of the year. Then how did the employees manage their schedules the first 9 months? Usually, a private concern would visit the office and provide 2 calendars to each civil servant as New Year gifts, one for the office and one for the home. The private company was driven by the altruism of serving the nation by serving government employees. so that civic work could be planned under the auspices of their logo. Some people requested a third calendar. The year of the incident, Kumarasura's colleagues' promptness in serving the nation had cost him dearly. He had made one little mistake, rolling up the old calendar and its 12 pictures of the king and chucking it into the bin. His reasoning could not be faulted. If each calendar sheet had been printed on one side, the paper on the other would have come in handy. What could one do with a calendar that was glossily printed on both sides? But an anonymous ill-wisher of his had taken a photograph of the king's pictures lying in the garbage and sent it along with an unsigned letter to the head office. The letter said Kumarasura's colleague had not just thrown away the calendar with its pictures, but had also stamped on it and driven it into the ground. The photograph did show a footprint on the king's face. Transfer orders were sent to the civil servant the next day. He rushed with a notice to the head office to plead his case, but no one would give him the time of day. When he finally managed to meet the minister in charge of his department, the latter said, "Follow the orders for now, we can figure this out later." The man had no choice. He moved cities. He said he had never ever insulted the king and that he was a faithful citizen who believed in the monarchy. He wrote a letter citing several anecdotes to support his case. For instance, once riding his motorcycle on the main street, he had happened to see the king's cavalcade. He had immediately got off his bike so he could bow low from the waist. But he found no respite. He now lived in a far-off place, and his family stayed behind in their town in the hope that the transfer would be rescinded. He was forced to dip into his savings to grease the palms of various officials at the head office who'd hinted that they could be bribed into helping him out. Kumarasura exercised extreme caution in such matters. He often said that a government servant ought to follow this golden rule. Never be the first to do anything. Always make sure someone precedes you. The last person to finish a task never got into trouble. This is such a lovely passage. So Sir was speaking earlier about, why he wrote this, the background to the story. So he spoke about, he's seen so many things as a government employee, their fear of, what they might do wrong, what action could be taken against them. And this calendar is considered, a calendar is something which all of us take for granted. Yeah, every year you get a new one, you throw away the old one. But even that could become such a huge thing. So he says he actually has seen one or two instances where a calendar has become the center of a huge controversy. So he said it's such a simple thing, but then it can balloon up into something which changes someone's life. So at this point, I said, so you have to give us one or two examples from real life, And he said this particular incident is based on something that he has seen in real life. So there was a calendar with one picture of a certain chief minister of the state. And the professor, once that month was over, had torn it off and, chucked it in the bin. And someone said the reason he did this was because he is against the chief minister and against that party. And not only had he torn it off, but he had stamped on it. This was the allegation against him. And it was investigated and he was transferred somewhere else. So this is something which has actually happened in our world. And therefore it could happen in Asura Lokam as well.
Yeah, so another question, sort of coming to the heart of what the novel is about, I guess. That you offer a very scathing, very sharp commentary on the dystopia that education is now, right? School and college, right? There's an entire city of schools. There's a people go on college tours, and it's like a mafia, no? It's really like a mafia, and which actually leads to the slaughtering of young people. You even mention a curated cemetery, which is a very chilling moment in the novel. Curated cemetery for young children who die, who can't take the pressure of these cram schools and so on. So there's all that. It gets crazier and crazier. So from the time of the child's conception, from the time Megas is conceived, the parents want him to become this and that and doctor and then this and that and so on and so forth, right? And also the vulnerability of parents, for whom this is the only ticket to happiness for their child, and that's what they want. And the way in which perspectives are very, very warped, right? So as a teacher yourself, I think you're also, you teach at a government arts college, you're a principal there and so on. Let me ask you the obvious question of how much of Estuary comes from your own, what you have observed around you. That's one. And two, how has that been received? Because it is, as I said, a mafia in its own way, a very powerful mafia, cram schools and so on. So that's my question.
சார், அதாவது இந்த நாவலுடைய கருப்பொருள் வந்து ரொம்ப ஒரு எதிர்மறையான கண்ணோட்டத்தோட நீங்க கல்வியை பத்தி பேசியிருக்கீங்க. இப்போ இந்த மாதிரி ஒரு நகரம் ஃபுல்லா பள்ளிக்கூடம் தான் இருக்கு. கல்லூரிக்கு வந்து சுற்றுலால போறாங்க. அதே மாதிரி அந்த பள்ளிக்கூடத்திலேயே ஒரு இடுகாடு இருக்கு. அதாவது அந்த குழந்தைங்க வந்து படிப்போட அந்த பிரஷரை தாங்க முடியாம தற்கொலை செஞ்சுக்கிறாங்க, இல்லாட்டி ஏதாவது நோய் வந்து செத்து போயிடுறாங்க. இத வந்து படிக்கும் போது அவங்களுக்கு வந்து ரொம்ப ஒரு மாதிரி ஒரு நடுக்கம் வந்திருக்கு. சோ மேகஸ பார்த்தாலும் பிறப்பிலிருந்து அவனோட பெற்றோர்களுக்கு வந்து அவனோட வாழ்க்கையை சுற்றி நிறைய கனவுகள் இருக்கு. ஒரு டாக்டர் ஆனோம், மருத்துவர் ஆனோம். அப்புறம் ஒரு வகையில பார்த்தா இது பெற்றோர்களுடைய பலவீனத்தை பத்தியும் பேசுறது. ஏன்னா இந்த குழந்தையோட சந்தோஷம், குழந்தையோட முன்னேற்றம், இந்த வாழ்க்கையில வந்து சந்தோஷம், முன்னேற்றம் எல்லாம் ஒரு ப்ரொஃபஷனல் சக்சஸோட தான் வரும் அப்படின்ற ஒரு கண்ணோட்டம் அவங்களுக்கு இருக்கு. சோ நீங்க வந்து காலேஜ்ல ப்ரொஃபஸரா இருந்திருக்கீங்க. சோ உங்களோட அனுபவத்துல இருந்து எஸ்டுவரி வந்து கழிமுகத்தோட அந்த கருப்பொருள் எவ்வளவு உங்களோட அனுபவத்தை பேஸ் பண்ணி நீங்க எழுதியிருக்கீங்க, அது ஒண்ணு. இன்னொன்னு, அது வந்து ஒரு ஆல்மோஸ்ட் ஒரு மாஃபியா மாதிரி, படிக்கும் போது ஒரு மாஃபியா மாதிரி தான் தெரியுது. சோ நீங்க இதெல்லாம் எழுதினதை படிச்சு மக்கள் என்ன சொல்லியிருக்காங்க? அதாவது கல்வித்துறையில இருக்கிற மக்கள் அதை எப்படி எடுத்திருக்காங்க?
இது நம்ம இப்ப நவீனமா இருக்கக்கூடிய கல்வி முறைய நீங்க வந்து கவனிச்சுட்டு வந்தீங்க அப்படின்னு சொன்னா, இந்த நாவல்ல எழுதியிருக்கிறது எதுவுமே வந்து ரொம்ப அதீதப்படுத்தி எழுதுனதுன்னு சொல்ல முடியாது. இன்னும் சொல்லப்போனா யதார்த்தத்துல இதை விட கூட மோசமா இருக்குது அப்படின்னு தான் பார்க்கணும். இப்ப நம்ம அதுல வந்து ஒரு காலேஜில் படிக்கிற ஒரு பையனும் பொண்ணும் பார்த்துக்கூடாது, பேசிக்கூடாது அப்படிங்கிறதெல்லாம் எவ்வளவு கடுமையாக அமுல்படுத்தப்படுது அப்படிங்கிறத நீங்க வந்து நடைமுறையில ஒரு ஃபேமஸா இருக்கக்கூடிய ஒரு 4 காலேஜஸ், என்ஜினியரிங் காலேஜ் விசாரிச்சீங்கன்னா சாதாரணமா தெரிஞ்சிடும். அந்த மாதிரியான ஒரு விஷயம்தான். அதனால இது கல்வி சம்பந்தமா நம்முடைய நாட்டில் நடக்கக்கூடிய விஷயங்களை ஒரு மேலோட்டமான ஒரு அப்சர்வ் பண்ணாலே இது கிடைச்சிரும். அதனால நான் வந்து அந்த மாதிரி ஒரு கல்வித்துறையில இருக்கக்கூடிய காரணத்தினால எனக்கு தொடர்ந்து கல்வி பற்றியான ஒரு அப்சர்வேஷன் உண்டு. அந்த அடிப்படையில எனக்கு வந்ததுதான் அது. அதனால இது என்னுடைய சொந்த அனுபவம் இல்லை, என்னுடைய அப்சர்வேஷன் அப்படின்னு தான் நான் இதை சொல்லுவேன். இது அப்புறம் இன்னைக்கும் நீங்க பாத்தீங்கன்னா கல்வி நகரங்கள் தமிழ்நாட்டுல இருக்கு, நீங்க பார்க்கலாம். அதை கல்வி நகரங்கள் இருக்கு, கல்வி தந்தைகள் இருக்கிறாங்க, அவர்கள்லாம் டாக்டர் பட்டம்லாம் வாங்கியிருப்பாங்க. ஆமா, அதெல்லாம் வந்து பல இடங்கள்ல இருந்து கிடைச்சிருக்கும். அதெல்லாம் அந்த மாதிரியான தன்மைகள்லாம் இருக்கு. அதனால வந்து இது அந்த மாதிரி ஒரு அப்சர்வேஷன்ல இருந்து எழுதப்பட்ட ஒரு விஷயம்தான் இது. நீங்க மாஃபியான்னு சொல்றீங்க, நான் அந்த வார்த்தையெல்லாம் வந்து பயன்படுத்துறதுக்கு எனக்கு தயக்கமா தான் இருக்குது. இன்னைக்கு கல்வி வந்து மிகப்பெரிய ஒரு முதலீடு கொண்ட ஒரு தொழிலாக இன்றைக்கு இருக்குது அப்படிங்கிறது ஒரு சந்தேகமே கிடையாது. அப்படி ஒரு மிகப்பெரிய முதலீடு கொண்ட ஒரு தொழில்ல மாஃபியாக்கள் இருப்பதுங்கிறது இயல்புதான் அப்படின்னு சொல்லி நான் முடிச்சுக்கிறேன்.
So Sir was saying that if you look at reality, if you just look at what is happening now in the educational system, you can't really say that his is a dystopian perspective, because if at all, the reality is even harsher, even more dystopian than what he has depicted in the novel itself. For instance, he says if you make inquiries at 4-5 engineering colleges and ask them, how are boys and girls allowed to interact, the level to which the separation is enforced, the ways in which boys and girls just normally speaking to each other's cohorts is seen as an evil thing, it will become evident. So when you can see this with just superficial inquiry, he says that, he's been part of the educational system for so long, and though it's not his personal experience, he has made several observations over the years about how the system has moved and how these rules have become more and more rigid over time, rather than things getting modernized and more liberal. And as for as for this thing of, cities with just schools in it, those do exist even in Tamil Nadu. Like there are schools, only schools in those cities where you cram schools. Like we all of us speak about quota, but in so many parts of the country, and it's, even in Tamil Nadu, these cram schools do exist. And he says, and there are also people who are considered kind of like these, demigods of education, people with doctorates, and people who make these large promises, and no one knows where they got these doctorates from. So he says, I'm not going to use the word mafia which you used, but what he will say is that in an industry like education has become now, with such a large investment and such large returns, it is natural for mafia to exist.
Yeah. So as part of the college tours that you talk about in your novel, right, which Kumar Asurar and his son Megas go on, they land up in various colleges, and there are various interesting, props, if you like, in each of these colleges. So one college, they offer these bridals for students. So they, like Nandini talked about it in the beginning, right? So students will not then look left or right. They'll be very focused on their studies and that kind of thing. Then there's another college where there are robots who, police students and make sure boys don't talk to girls. And in a third college, and that I found quite terrifying, there are these canes, very fancy bamboo canes, which only cause internal injuries, right? So there are no external visible scars on students, but they might actually end up with internal injuries if they talk or if they do something that isn't academic in that sense, right? So, so there's all of that. So I just wondered if, if either of you would care to read from any one of these three parts of the novel: the bridal bit, the robot bit, or the bamboo cane bit. I mean, they're all, I was trying to think which of these three is my favorite. I couldn't come up with one, so I leave that.
Let's leave that to Murugan sir. அதாவது இந்த கல்லூரி சுற்றுலாக்களை நீங்க வந்து இயந்திரங்கள் பத்தி பேசிருக்கீங்க, கடிவாளங்கள் பத்தி பேசிருக்கீங்க, அப்புறம் பிரம்புகள் யூஸ் பண்ணி இந்த மாதிரி ஒரு இதுவை அமல்படுத்துறத பத்தி நீங்க பேசிருக்கீங்க. இந்த மூணுத்துல உங்களுக்கு ரொம்ப பிடிச்சது, ஐ மீன் உங்களுக்கு ரொம்ப பிடிச்ச பகுதி என்ன? பிடிச்ச முறைன்னு கேட்க போறது இல்ல, ரொம்ப பிடிச்ச பகுதி என்ன?
கடிவாளம் தான். அந்த பகுதியை எழுதும் போது ரொம்ப ரசிச்சு எழுதுனேன் நான்.
Yeah, so I asked, sir, I'm not going to ask you which is your favorite method of disciplinary enforcement, but which of these is your favorite to read? Would you like me to read? And he says is the one with bridals. That's something which he really enjoyed writing. So Srilata, I wonder if you could help me with the page.
I think it's on page 69. 69.
Yeah, let me see if it is. Yeah.
69.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you. That's perfect. Yeah. So this is when Meghas and his father visit the first college that they visit. So I'll read this part. The college was spread across 300 to 400 acres. Its buildings were skyscrapers. You could give yourself a crick in the neck trying to see just how tall they were, but all you'd get for your pains would be sun blindness. It couldn't have been an easy task to acquire such vast tracts of land close to a metropolis. I guess this is where what Sir said about, mafias entering any industry where the investment and returns are high comes in. So they go on this tour. They are introduced to, they're given a sort of virtual tour of the college. And it says a part of the administrative building had been allocated for the orientation program with separate areas for parents and students. Kumarasuran made his way to the parents section. The college had a promotional film made to show prospective parents the facilities on the campus. They were given a virtual tour of the classrooms, laboratories, the hostels, and the students' mess. The final words of the narration that accompanied the video were, "Bridles fitted with blinkers will be provided free of cost to students. This is to ensure that they do nothing, that they do not lose focus. Our motto is work, work, and do nothing but work. Discipline is crucial to living up to this motto. This is why we have provided bridles for our boys and girls." At the students' orientation, Meghas was told, "The restrictions on campus are not for our benefit, but for yours. Remember that horses are able to keep to a straight path without distractions and reach their eventual goal because of their bridles. Don't you want to make sure you reach your goals? Don't you want to have offers of jobs at multinational companies even before you finish your courses? Once the counseling was done, the parents and prospective students were taken around the campus in open vans. On several walls, they could see the college motto painted in large letters: work, work, and do nothing but work. Their first stop was the factory where the bridles were manufactured. The fact that our bridles are given free of charge does not imply they are of low quality. We make no compromises. Our bridles provide for a direct gaze, the gaze required to work, work, and do nothing but work. When distractions are removed, the mind is at rest. When the mind is at rest, the body cooperates. When the body cooperates, one can study. When one studies, one will find work. This is why we make our own bridles. You can examine their quality for yourself. Each of them is built to last through all 5 years of college. If a student happens to lose his bridle, a free replacement will be provided the first 2 times. We have colors and models of bridles. We have delicate iron bridles for our female students. Just like slippers, bridles too are gendered. You can see which ones are meant for the faces of young women. You may choose any model you like. The choice is your right. Our only rule is that it must be worn at all times. So then there's this passage about how they examine the bridles. So I'll move to that. The parents rushed to the bridles giggling. They fixed the bridles on themselves and saw that they did indeed give them the promised direct gaze. One could see nothing to one side. This thrilled the parents. They admired their appearance in the mirrored walls of the room. Some even trotted, jumped, and neighed like horses and laughed at their own exploits. When their sons were reluctant to wear them, the parents fitted the bridles onto the boys' faces and dragged them to the mirrors to see how well these accessories suited them. Some of the boys quite willingly wore the colorful bridles and asked their parents for their opinions on which were most becoming. So then, when they're having this discussion, one of the parents asks a question. They filter the noise from the students' ears, they focus their eyesight, but they don't do anything to seal their mouths. Why is that? Parents have been making this request only for the last 2 years, a professor says. The authorities have taken this into consideration. A decision is yet to be made on whether a bit must be attached to the bridle or made separately and also supplied for free. We hope for the bits to be made available towards the middle of this academic year. Please do not worry.
Thank you, Nandini. I had questions for you before we run out of time.
Right.
We have about 8 to 10 minutes, Srilata.
Sure. We'll stick to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. So Nandini, just tell us a little bit about how you got started on the project of translating Estuary, and it's clearly a labor of love. I can see that, and I really have enjoyed how seamlessly this reads in English. There's nothing pretentious about it at all. It's really lovely translation. So do tell us a little about the joys of doing this, about the challenges. How did you work with the dialect, which is a very specific dialect, isn't it, the original? And how much of back and forthing did it involve with Murugan sir, with yourself, your own head, the dictionary and all of that? And also, how much did you have to travel outside of your comfort zone to do this?
Actually, I'm so glad you asked that question because it allows me to talk about you. I'm sure a lot of people will know this, but Srilata translated her mother's wonderful novel, Vattathul, from Tamil. And, I guess, your mother is somebody whom you love, so you obviously want to do your very best. And I guess also part of it has to do with the fact that you're an author yourself. So even if you don't see it as a daughter, when you look at it from her perspective as an author, you know just how precious it is. So I guess being a writer myself helped me in looking at this from Murugan sir's perspective, right from the title Kazhimugam. A lot of his books don't have the same titles in English. In the first time I met Murugan sir was to interview him about Madhuru Bagan when One Part Woman had come out. Before the country in 2014 for the book fair. And I met him then, before he was this controversial figure, and I'd done an interview over a few days with him. And then he spoke about, we have Madhuru Bhagan. It's not exactly one part woman. You can, and there are so many words for it in Tamil. Madhuru Bhagan, Imayoru Bhagan, Mangai Pangan, Ardhanari. And I'm recalling all this because the way Sir speaks, it sticks in your head, you know. So the very first meeting, he was speaking about this. And these are all impressions which were made then. And when you've been so personally acquainted with somebody discussing his work, and before I met him, I'd read all his novels, and Anirudhan, who did that translation, is a very dear friend of mine. So in a way, we met not as strangers, and over time, I guess after the controversy, I was really upset, and then in the judgment, some sections of the profile I'd written on Sir were quoted. So in a way, we've also been very closely bonded. And the Jaipur Lit Fest last year, Sir wanted to read out a poem about from Songs of a Coward, Korean Padalgal. And there was no translation in English available at that time. And Kalyan Raman Sir was at Jaipur, but he was at another session on translation. So I said, okay, I'll translate this for you quickly. And then I guess when Kazhimugam came out, Kannan Sundaram, his publisher, asked me if, you know, I would want to translate this. And I said, you know, sure, I'd love to. I think with the dialect, a lot of it has to do with, you know, you can't be overwhelmed by it. Of course, it's challenging and things like that. But then I would think, okay, if Murugan Sir said this and I'm trying to explain it to a friend who doesn't understand Tamil, how would I explain a joke? You know, how would you explain, for example, that Varaparam joke, which is so, it's, you know, or the Petromax Slam Goundamani Sendil joke? How do you explain it to someone who hasn't watched Tamil cinema? There are ways you can explain it, you know, using other languages, using English or Hindi. So for me, I guess that was something which was very important, that I had to bring the spirit of Murugan Sir into this. And like I've said in several interviews, because Murugan Sir has such a strong and fluent vocabulary in Tamil, sometimes even Wikipedia and Google are no matches for him, you know. So he would often be my only dictionary and encyclopedias. I would call him up and say, sir, what is Muruvan, for example, you know? And he would say, okay, that is pig. I say, okay, but why have you said Pandri and Muruvan? So there are things like that. And I'm talking about various other works of his. And then he would explain the difference. And then I would have to find a way to convey it to the audience. So I guess those were the challenges, but it's something I thoroughly enjoyed. And I guess my love for the work and my love for the author and for his legacy in literature, all the works that I've read and loved, all of it, I guess, it's also, that's the labor of love that you see.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, one more question for you, Nandini. You know, so as a translator, obviously you've not just read, as in read the novel, but you have particular reading or readings, maybe even, right? Of the book, of the work. Yeah. So if you can maybe in a couple of minutes tell us, you know, so I had a certain reading of it, and which came through perhaps in some of the questions I asked. But, you know, if you could tell us how you have read the novel, and what is it about the novel that struck a chord in you?
I guess all of us gravitate towards the portions of the novel which reflect our own interests. And for me, mental health is a huge area of interest because there's so much that goes on in our minds which we don't speak about. And, you know, with Murugan Sir, so far he has spoken about the world outside, whether it's caste or, you know, sort of prejudice or toxic masculinity or whatever. But here he delves into the mental health of this man in a way which he hasn't done so far, I think. And that's what really struck a chord, because there's this beautiful chapter where he goes into a sort of fugue state and he's imagining things, and you yourself, in 3-4 chapters, you don't know whether what you're reading is real or whether you're in Kumarasura's mind or whether it's a dream. And I think that was the part I enjoyed most, both as an achievement of literature itself and the topic that he was touching upon.
Yeah, which kind of, yeah, I think we're almost out of time, right, Vijay?
Maybe a couple of minutes more. I just got a message from Murugan. He says his net connection is very poor. Okay. And so he says, please continue with Nandini.
Okay, then, okay, fine. So I had another question, as not a question so much as you've read various portions of the novel at my request. But is there a particular, little excerpt that you would like to read, or maybe just even talk about, which either you found terribly challenging? I mean, you spoke about something that you could relate to, the hallucinations that
Right.
the protagonist goes through, and what goes on in his head and that kind of thing. But was there a portion of the text that you found maybe particularly challenging? Would you like to tell us about that? Would you like to read that out?
Oh, actually, because I think we are almost out of time, so I can refer to something which we've already read at the launch of the book, which our viewers can access online, which also happens to be the most challenging part, because it's a chapter which is the crux of the novel, and it is set at the estuary. So it's both a literal and metaphorical estuary. And the reason it was so challenging was that not only is it kind of like a dreamlike, surreal situation, but it is a flight of fantasy, and the words, it's almost like Murugan sir was a tool for something extraordinary, like these words were pouring out of the universe and he just wrote them. There was that kind of largeness to it. There was that kind of cosmic dimension to that chapter. And for me, I think that was the most challenging, and therefore it's also the most satisfying, because I worked on it like for maybe 3-4 days just on revising the words in that. And the first person to read both was my mother, because she reads both Tamil and English. And I said, Mommy, read this chapter. I don't care what else you read. And she said, oh, it's perfect. It's exactly like he wrote it. And, and of course, which is biased because she's my mother, but I'll take that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I connect that to a question that has come from the audience, Nandini?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, Nandini, first of all, congratulations. Translating, on the spot is something enviable. And the way you have done it is terrific.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's wonderful. One question that has come is that translating dialect, I think this is something that Sridhata has already asked, but related to that, it's very difficult to it's very difficult to get the nuances right and retain the essence and tone of its language. And maintaining Kongu dialect in particular is very challenging. And how has been your experience?
I think the important thing is, when you have dialect and when you have certain words, one huge advantage we have is that if we allow ourselves to treat it as a translation, we can also step outside and explain that to the reader, like the word choose. And this is something I learned actually from Amit Chaudhary, from his novel Freedom Song, where he says, because a lot of times we think of translation only as, okay, Murugan sir has written this and I'm translating this, but Juno Diaz translates because he writes in English of Spanish settings. Amit Chaudhary translates because he writes in English about Bengali families. Therefore, a lot of the texts that we actually read are translated. And so I was thinking about how they express things. And I guess they were my inspiration in some senses, or Kudzi for that matter, GM Kudzi. He translates from Afrikaans to English, right? Like in speech. So I thought, okay, how would he say it? How would they say it? If you use the word, for example, the Afrikaans word, I think it's tante, which means aunt. And he would explain that the reason that this is, just like when we say auntie in India, we don't really mean auntie, but somebody who's close enough as close as a family member. So I guess these were workarounds that I used. Like when he uses a particular word in Tamil, I would use that word and say he used this word meaning this.
And also, I think related to that is this question about about glossary. Right? This is Ramakrishna who is asking. There is no glossary at the end of the novel. Why is it so? I mean, is it necessary that one can do away with the glossary, or will the context give the meaning? So it's not given at the end of the novel. Is there a specific reason for not providing a glossary?
Yeah, I think this was also something which Murugan sir and I discussed, because he writes for a Tamil audience which is familiar with things. For me, I guess it was that at a time of Google and Wikipedia, you don't really need a glossary. When you can just, you don't understand a word, you can look it up and you might learn a lot more than you would with 4 lines at the back. And also it's important to say that these are not marginalized literatures, or these are not marginal literatures where you need a glossary. Now, why isn't there a glossary in a book written by, let's say, Jeffrey Archer saying King's Cross station in London, right? We don't expect that. Why do we not expect that? Therefore, or Vatican, religious place for Catholics. You don't see that in, let's say, Dan Brown. And these are read by hundreds of millions of people across the world. So why can't Perumal Murugan be as popular as these people, though of a higher literary standard than them?
Yeah. There are a couple of comments supporting what I said. Nandini, your almost instantaneous translation is excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
But one question probably which you or Srilata can answer is, somebody was asking where is the Tamil version available, because very often we are only coming across the English version. This was Radha Seturaman is asking where can I find the Tamil version of the book? I see only the English copy. I don't know where she is
so
from.
the Tamil version is published.
Kalachuvadu.
Yeah, by Kalachuvadu.
So you should get it in any bookstore which sells Tamil books.
Yeah, I suppose
In
it
fact,
should
I
be
think it's
available on
available
all these online books.
Amazon as well.
Amazon also, they do have a Tamil selection. Actually.
Yeah, so Kannan Sundaram and yeah,
they have to.
right.
Yeah.
And
It's called Kazhimugam, in case you're not familiar with the title.
yeah, I suppose the person who has asked the question is a Tamil speaker, so I'm sure she would get that. And of course, since Murugan is not here, I don't think we should ask this question about his journey from being, from being a writer who is gone into hiding and then coming back. That's not something. But I had, I was reading this novel, and you managed to read that section about those 7 questions without actually, laughing, without, with a straight face. I just couldn't read it, without actually stopping and laughing my heart out. But something that really struck me was particularly, in the early part of the book, there is so much of, at least, pardon my references, but, so much of it sounded like R.K. Narayan. Particularly his early morning walk to the municipal grounds, and the routine sitting there and eating vadais and so on and so forth. It was so much like R.K. Narayan. So I was actually wondering what kind of literary, if not influence, influence is the wrong word, but the kind of literary world in which Murugan really partakes. Whether I'm not sure whether you can answer that question, but anything that probably his references to other writers and things like that. Would you be able to?
So Murugan, yeah. No, Murugan, so because a lot of, maybe even this thing about his coming out of exile is not something he himself likes to talk about, because that was a very ugly period in his life. But he has spoken about it when he's been kind of coerced to, because he's a very he's a very nice person, never says no to anything. But I have some really interesting nuggets which he told me during those 2-3 days when I was interviewing him back in 2014. Where he said, he came from a farming family. So when he took up literature, he said he was the first person to have a college education in the entire family. So all they understood was, okay, the boy is going to college, he's going to be successful. He said in a way that was his biggest advantage, that the entire family was illiterate. And these were the words he used, So he studied Tamil literature right from when he wanted to. And therefore, from a very young age, maybe 17 or so, he was exposed to a variety of literature. But he told me that when he was much younger than that, back then he had to order books by VPP. And the day the postman came with, this package, he said it would be almost as if someone had died, as if there'd been a death in the family. Everyone would be sitting and, looking like, oh God, this boy who's spending money on storybooks. And I know that he was very close to Sundar Ramaswamy, the founder of Kalachuvadu, and whose son Kannan Sundaram is. He is very close to him. And in fact, somebody told me that the section which he read out last time, that part at the estuary itself, that in some ways it reminds him, the person who said this was the filmmaker R.V. Ramani. He said it reminds him of J.J. Silakuripukal by Sundar Ramaswamy himself. So I think he would have been one of Murugan sir's big influences, both in terms of style, in terms of personality too, because they were very close.
Yeah, and also there is a question by Lavanya, who asks, how many days has it taken for you to translate this book?
Okay, so I promised VK Karthika, the publisher who commissioned it to me from Westland, that I would give her a draft within 40 days, like 1 day for each chapter, So I worked maybe 18 hours a day just to give her that first draft. And since after that, we spent about 6 months, I think, going through draft after draft after draft, ironing out every word and wrinkle in the text.
Yeah, and since you mentioned that, I wanted to ask you about your experience with the publishers, editors, those who go through the translation and suggest changes, etc. Was it a very happy collaboration? Because I have some small experience of translation, and we usually ended up fighting, and I refusing to change a word, and then the translator who had no idea of Telugu from which I was translating, suggesting that no, this is not sounding right, and this is sounding very. So, what was your experience like with the editors and reviewers and so on?
I think that was really good for me, because the line editor whom I worked with also is a Tamil speaker, and I don't think she read the original, which was good also, because she was able to point out places where it might sound stilted, or why not go with this. But also the fact was, I was able to explain to her that, look, a lot of the words are something which, because I saw myself as Murugan sir's representative, and I said, no, this has to be there, because in the foreword, he says that I've deliberately made certain errors, I've repeated myself, I've gone into lengthy description. So sometimes the line editor, her name is Janani Ganeshan. So she said, some of his sentences are too short. Why don't we join a couple of them together? I said, no, he said in the foreword that he's made these errors on purpose. Therefore, it has to be that way. And she said, okay, fine. So it was very pleasant. But I was glad to have that little tug of war, but it was nice. I think the novel benefited greatly from the fact that we were coming from two different perspectives.
Yeah, I know, because sometimes, I'm not complaining, but very often what really happens is the person who is editing it doesn't really know the original, not just the original book, but the original language also. And so some of those deliberate foreignizations are sought to be kind of nativized by a kind of a smooth translation, which actually goes against the grain of the book itself. So yeah, so glad to hear that. And thank you, Nandini. It was wonderful. And Srilata, thank you very much. And unfortunately, Murugan is not here, but I wanted to thank him also for taking the trouble to be online from, not from home. But I also wanted to tell him that how much I enjoyed the foreword. I think it's extremely, tongue-in-cheek. What he says about Asuraloka being so different. But then, of course, when you read, you realize that it is actually our world that he is writing about. The foreword actually, came as a surprise to me. I mean, because knowing the kind of serious writer that Murugan is, but it was really tongue-in-cheek. And that foreword was very, very interesting. And thank you, Nandini, once again. And Srilata, thank you. And in absentia, Murugan, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of today's session. But before we leave, I just wanted to make an announcement about our next session. As you know, we'll be back 15 days from now, and we will be back on October 2nd, same time, 7 p.m. And we will be focusing on a very new book called India Tomorrow, Interviews with Next Generation Leaders. This has come out from OUP. And the authors, Pradeep Chibbar and Harsh, will be in conversation with Manjari Kadju, who is a professor of political science at University of Hyderabad. And so we will be back with you once again at 7 p.m. on October 2nd. And I hope to see all of you back once again, and many more, of you at the next session of HLF. Thank you once again. Nandini, Srilata, and Murugan, on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, and the entire team HLF. Thank you once again, and have a good evening. Thank you.